Beautiful people of the internet, and welcome once more to the Sunday special live. And as you can see, we've had a change of location from sunny Birmingham all the way up to sunny Dubai with myself, Helen Chorley, Piotr Ruznek, and the magnificent Adam Lawrence, of course. And I think we've got some real cannon fodder for discussion today. We've got Black Rock, Northern Rock Part 2. By the looks of things. And if you want to talk about subprime investment markets going Pete Tong, well, yeah.
It might bring memories back for me. Have we got tissues ready just in case I cry? Still processing the trauma from 2008.
Welcome to Catharsis with Helen Chorley. Yes, could be an interesting few days, couldn't it? That's for sure. But I think I put in the supplement today, it could also be business as usual for about 6 months. I've seen some good and interesting commentary around, but what seems to be lacking from some of the analysis that I've been seeing is just the fundamental understanding of how the bond market works, really. And this is, part of the fallout. I don't know if Michael Burry's been on Twitter saying, yeah, see, I told you this would happen or whatever, but this is part of the fallout of interest rates moving upwards very quickly. It's as simple as that. So this is not a Northern Rock situation. Was ultimately, yes, a lot of things were overvalued and there was a lot of fresh air, but ultimately the loans stopped performing. And that's obviously what happened in the US as well. People... Now, in the US, they've been set up to fail in a very clinical way where they gave these kind of 2-year breaks on interest rates. And that was Dr. Michael's prime point of order as was exemplified best in The Big Short. When these 2-year rates, these discount rates, as they were called, started to fade away, there was just an inevitability about the whole thing. Unless the interest rate had crashed through the floor. But that was these discount trackers. And we had discount trackers in the UK, don't get me wrong. So there was almost this guarantee that there would continue to be this problem. And because it was a typical bubble, things were sort of cycling up and cycling up and cycling up. Whereas what this is not about non-performance. This is about if you have $10 billion in bonds that were yielding 1% or 1.5% when you bought them, and those bonds are now yielding 7%, then fundamentally those bonds have lost value. Now, you're still going to get, it's not that they're not performing, it's not that the mortgages aren't being paid if we're talking mortgage-backed securities, it's simply that you could go and buy that same $100 million worth or $10 billion worth or whatever it is at a much lower price today than you paid for them. So you might only have to pay $8 billion to buy the same bunch of bonds, or maybe even less. And if you've done that, and then someone, enter Peter Thiel from stage left, someone starts a bit of a panic because he asks his massive conglomerate to withdraw their funds, it starts a bank run. And in the old, when it was Washington Mutual in 2008, I think it took 9 days before the FDIC stepped in. Whereas with internet transfers and all the rest of it now, it's more like 9 hours before somebody steps in and goes, well, we can't really do all of those withdrawals. So there's a big problem. We've got a run on the bank. And it just shows you it's partly because confidence is so low at the moment in general. One person, in fact, not that he put it out on Twitter, of course, for obvious reasons, but one person, that is topical for later on in the debate today, I'm sure. But one person's actions, yes, a very influential, very wealthy person, effectively brings down a bank. I mean, that's sort of what happened with FTX, really, although it was all a bit of a smoke and mirrors job anyway. One person happens to be the CEO of their biggest rival.
So could we start with this kind of big business? Because I don't think many people kind of realize what this big thing is about, and it's all about this bank in California.
Sure. So there's actually 2 banks both in California this week that have gone broke. One didn't make massive news. It's called Silvergate. It was effectively heavily exposed to crypto. So you can imagine banking licenses are seen as a license to print money. You take money from A and you lend it to B and you make a margin. Now, the problem is in today's world where everything is squeezed, it's not quite as simple as all of that. And if we go back sort of 6 months to the pension fund crisis and what happened with Liz Truss, the pension funds are holding lots and lots of money in bonds, and they're holding them because they know roughly what their liabilities are, right? So they know when they're going to have to pay the money out. It all makes sense. But again, as interest rates start to go up, the value of the bonds themselves goes down. In times of high inflation, bonds are not desirable anyway, because you put $1,000 or £1,000 into a bond and you get your money back in 6 months, 1 year, 5 years. Now, if there's a view that inflation is going to be high, that £1,000 is obviously significantly eroded in value. And one thing we haven't dealt with, the last 12 months aside, for many years is any significant inflation. So bonds become less desirable, price goes down, so the yield goes up. So as I say, if you bought the same bonds today, you might be quite happy with those 6 or 7% returns if they're mortgage-backed securities. But the problem is the bank, rather than leaving any of the excess money, because remember we use the fractional reserve banking system, so rather than leaving all those deposits sloshing around somewhere, they're actually buying very, very safe assets like bonds. And because they know that they're only going to use maybe 2 or 3% of their liquidity at any one time during normal trading conditions, and that's a very important set of quote marks there. And they're required under the capital adequacy rules, which changed significantly since 2008,
Exactly.
to only hold a fraction of their overall deposits, although that fraction is about 3 times as big as it was for some banks in sort of 2007, 2008. But it's still a fraction, right? And so they're holding all of these bonds on the basis that, well, this money, they might well have been paying 2 years ago depositors 0.1% and been getting 1.5% on these securities and thinking, well, that's a good deal, isn't it? Easy money, free money. Well, the problem is, if what's happened has happened, and I'm still not aware of anyone who predicted quite such a meteoric rise over the interest rates. Certainly going back a couple of years, we were chatting about negative rates and things like that. I don't know anybody who's yet come out and said, yes, I predicted this whole acceleration. But in
said something about interest rates going massively up were kind of labeled as conspiracy theories, and people who just are not reliable predictors of future. But actually a lot of things that those people were saying are coming kind of being realized.
Apart from maybe crypto going down 80%, I'd agree with you. Yeah.
That as well, yeah.
There is a value in taking a contrarian view.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's one of those things, you roll the dice enough times, you're going to run sixes 4 or 5 times in a row.
True.
Yeah.
Roll 10,000 heads, flip 10,000 heads and tails, and you get 8 heads in a row, and then everyone thinks it's a biased coin, and that's the problem with it's the gambler's fallacy, which is one of my absolute favourite topics of all time. But yeah, so go back to Silvergate. No big surprise. You enter a competitive marketplace like banking, you need a niche. Their niche was going to be crypto, so they were a sleepy little bank that had been going for I think about 30 years. And then they found or maybe 20 years before the CEO got involved in crypto back in 2013, and they saw a big angle, and they went public, and the value blew up, and then it blew down very quickly. But we're talking about a bank that had maybe 10 billion of deposits. So whilst that's an insane amount of money, it's not particularly significant in California, which, as I said in the supplement today, is the 4th biggest economy in the world.
That is amazing. I said to Jay, I'm like, listen to this. I had no idea. That is really, when you put it in context, 4th in the world, like sod any other country. That's amazing, isn't it? It's absolutely.
It's crackers. Absolutely crackers. Knocks England on its own into a cocked hat, which is incredible. But then Silicon Valley Bank, you'll probably guess from the name, it was its niche was funding towards tech. The sort of general protocol in the sector would be you might do a very big raise with a good idea. Let's say you raise $10 million out in the States with not much more than an idea. You might be only burning, say, $500,000 a month or less in terms of your burn costs, but you've raised the money, so you've got runway. What are you going to do with the money? Well, you put it into a bank, and you put it into a bank that caters for tech startups and entrepreneurs, and that was what Silicon Valley Bank were. Currently in receivership now under the FDIC, which is the equivalent to our official receiver and or the central bank taking control, and our financial services compensation scheme, which guarantees bank deposits up to 85k. In the States, they're guaranteed up to $250,000, but you can understand if you've got a small client base with millions or tens of millions of dollars in there, then there's a problem, and it puts people's payroll at risk. It puts the tech sector overall at risk. So then, of course, hindsight is 2020. So you can look back and say, well, you know what? Tech had this giant boom during the pandemic. There was nothing else for people to spend their money on. 5 years of growth in 6 months and all these things that were said. Elon's net worth went from about $26 billion, I think, to $310 billion over the course of the pandemic. And that was effectively Tesla's shares just going absolutely crazy. You'll know if you follow the sector, there's been a bit of a correction, to say the least, in 2022. And some of that has obviously continued. So the point really is tech has suffered, valuations have suffered. Now the tech bank suffers. But now the cat's once again out the bag here. Our pension funds back in September, October were holding bonds that were out of the money, as a trader would call them, aka you could buy them at much lower prices than you bought them at and they were on your books at. And the same's happened here. These banks are holding, and there's a pretty scary chart that Rod shared actually on Facebook on Friday about just how much, if you used what's called mark-to-market accounting, which is basically updating the value of everything in real time, there's some significant write-downs that would be needed. Now, of course, those banks will defend that and say, well, we've got, like Bank of America, for example, is holding quite a lot of unrealized losses in this way. But Bank of America's argument will be, no, we hold all of these bonds to maturity, so we don't need to reprice them. Now, that's fine unless there's a run on Bank of America, and this is what happened at Silicon Valley Bank. Then they need to sell these bonds, and they have to go into the market, and they have to accept the lower price. So then they've got a gap. Then they've got a big gap, and that's what they had, a big billions of dollars hole. But it only takes that confidence to be broken. So the reports are that a lot of the tech startup style banks, which are operating under different banking licenses, have seen a lot of deposits flow into them because companies are trying to hedge their bets with making sure they're not exposed to one particular bank or whatever. Now, I mentioned Bank of America, but they do look like they've got really significant liquidity. So they shouldn't really be in any trouble at all. But Silicon Valley Bank was actually the 16th biggest bank in the whole of the US. So not a small consideration. And this is the second biggest US bank failure of all time. And that's an interesting Wikipedia page if you've never been on it. I haven't been on it till this week. List of US bank failures, and let's just say there's quite a bit of scrolling that needs to be done. If you go down that list, a lot of scrolling, and that doesn't include things like Lehman and Bear and stuff, investment banks. This is deposit taking banks, retail banks, or vanilla banking, if you like. So it's amazing how this whole picture sort of comes together. And then, of course, the question is there contagion within the tech startup sector? The economy wouldn't really feel that impact for many years, you wouldn't think, because you're not going to see the benefits of a lot of these things for some time. And a lot of there won't be shedding too many tears for tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley or whatever, because they're not under remunerated the last time I checked. But it's where contagion can spread to, and this causes people questioning the system. If they question the system so much that they ran to the bank and took all their money and put it under the bed, that would be a major league. You remember those Northern Rock queues that you saw on the TV with people? You don't see that anymore because they're just queuing on the website instead of in the branch. That no Silicon Valley branch. I probably only had 1 or 2 branches anyway.
I know those banks kind of like related to like UK banks, or is it or are there any UK banks that are very like heavily invested into tech? So like kind of are there similarities to like the UK or?
Well, Silicon Valley Bank did have a UK arm, SVB UK, much smaller, of course, but still there is several hundred people, if not a low thousands, that might be affected by this and the delay. And the Bank of England have announced that they are taking them into receivership. So they effectively will have their assets frozen, despite, I think there was a Zoom call on Friday afternoon with the CEO of the American bank saying, yeah, don't worry, everyone will get their money back. And then about 45 minutes later, down goes the portcullis, You've seen the banking sector shares dropped significantly. So I speculated that one of the it's really twofold in terms of what it might mean for property. In that, someone asked me a very intelligent question on Friday morning, or maybe Saturday morning. Does this mean that the central banks will stop putting the interest rate up quite so much? Because of course, this whole scenario is caused by this quite quick repricing in bonds. And I've said it before, the worldwide bond market is $325 trillion. Now, I don't know that the 4 of us are holding too many of those, nor are many individuals as it goes. So my point is, it's all institutional, it's all corporate, and it's all, generally speaking, the pension funds and the banking sector that are holding these bonds. So they've lost big money, right? They haven't declared those losses because they haven't been required to on an accounting basis. Those losses, like anything, it's a bit like what happens in 2008 in London. Well, most people could afford to hold on to their property. So the fact the price might have come down 15% if they'd needed to liquidate it there and then, it wasn't really relevant to them. If they could pay the mortgage, then they sat on it until it went. And then, of course, it pretty much doubled in value in the 2010s. And they were very happy that they sat on it and didn't crystallize those losses. So it's kind of the same argument in the banking sector right now. Barclays took a 7% hit. Of course, because of the way the timings work, when the FTSE was closed, this wasn't all out on the, it's 4:30 p.m. in London. What is it? It's 8:30 a.m. in California, and Friday was a big day, So I'd expect to see some red at the opening of trading tomorrow. And of course, it always starts with the Asian markets anyway. But Barclays 7% down. I Googled that as well. It's about the 4th time in 7 years that Barclays have had a 7% plus adjustment in their share price. So that probably puts it into context. Some of those bits of news I didn't even remember, to be honest with you. But they were significant to Barclays, and Barclays have international exposure, of course. If you look at where it might impact, so to go back to that very good question I got asked, it's the one thing that might persuade the central banks to slow down on the interest rate rises, because the whole rhetoric has been control inflation at all costs, right? But actually, it's more important that there's faith in the financial system than we deal with a bit of inflation. And this is the first thing that's come up that would actually trump controlling inflation, in my book, in the short term, right? So if they stop putting the rates up and the bond yields come down, and that's what happened on Friday, bond yields came down. Now, that's on the basis that some of these rates might need to be lowered or are going to be under downward pressure for other reasons, right? So that helps us because that lowers our mortgage costs, right? About 15 basis points came off the 5-year bond and the 5-year SONIA swap. So that's welcome for anybody. But then the flip side is also problematic. If you've got banks, and we have lots of them in the property space, like Paragon or Aldermore or Shawbrook, who take deposits and then try and lend them out. What we need to be concerned about is, are all their deposits being lent out, and have they got a negative differential? if they've got a positive surplus of deposits, which would be your Bank of America's and your JP Morgans and stuff like that, where's that money sitting and what's it doing? Now, if also people stop depositing or remove funds from the system, it removes those deposits to be lent, and then margins probably increase slightly. So it's a really fine balance. Helen was going to say something wise from experience, so I'll shut up for 5 minutes.
No, just thinking about the exposure that all the banks will have. They are so exposed to each other by way of trading, by way of ownership of each other's shares. Like there's exposure on multi levels. There's even like day-to-day kind of intraday exposure. And you saw that with the Lehman example, like the UK branch, their money gets swept, i.e. sent to the US bank account overnight, and it got swept. Everything went boom, as I very well remember. And there's nothing left in the UK branch at that time. And that's not anything odd. It's not anything sinister. It's just the way banks work. That's a very standard procedure. But by God, it matters when something goes pop. So
Absolutely.
People, there might be all types of that stuff unraveling this week, which will not hit the headlines until later. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. The full impact of this, we won't know yet.
So I think that answers a bit of question from Luke. Been watching the last few days events closely. Does Adam agree SVB event could trigger contagion of further runs due to lack of hedging their exposure?
Well, as Helen says, what do you do if you're in charge? Let's say in that example, there's 10 billion in the UK account, right? And overnight you can earn 0.07% in the US overnight market, right? What do? You move the money, right? You move the money because it's 7 million quid, right? So you move the money, and it's very difficult to look. These banks the margins are kept lower by using some, and that's the same for the pension funds. If the pension funds weren't using the leveraged liability-driven investment, then they wouldn't have been able to pay their obligations, or the money needs to come from somewhere. So it's very difficult for them not to be exposed to each other. And this was a big the simple way I remember it from 2008 was everybody had a model that predicted what would happen if the price dropped by X, but the problem is those models weren't sophisticated enough to understand that if it went down by X, there wouldn't be any buyers in the market, and they couldn't dump this stuff. So that's why what effectively happened in the big players' houses is ultimately they kept the music going as long as they could, offloaded them to their clients, and behaved pretty sharkishly, really, and did what they needed to do to survive. And then when they couldn't survive that, they went to Warren Buffett's door, knocked on it, and said, "Uncle Warren, can you lend us? Got a couple of quid spare? What are we talking? Like a 5? But we know like 10 billion or something. If you could just have a look down the back of the sofa, 20 billion. That sort of level of money." So it's difficult for them not to be interrelated so much, but they're squeezing the very last piece out of the lemon. The problem from a mathematical standpoint comes from modelers using the normal distribution to model this, the old bell curve that you see when if you line up everybody in terms of the order of their height, you get a bit of a bell curve, right? The problem is that doesn't happen in finance, generally speaking. You have to deal with what are called fat tails.
Yes.
And it's those events, the black swan events, the 4 sigma plus events that are very rare, that have much more extreme outcomes. So the probability is not 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000. It's actually 1 in 100. And if you misstate the probability of 1 in 10,000 as 1 in 100, that's 100 times the magnitude of the mistake, right? Now, it's still very rare, but a pandemic, global pandemic was a 1 in 100-year event. Whether it is going forwards is a completely other kettle of fish. Some would argue it's much less likely now because of measures that would be taken. Some would argue it's much more likely, especially as there's still question marks over exactly how the virus originated. But rather than touch on that controversial subject, maybe we could touch on maybe you guys could kick off with how you feel about Mr. Lineker and the efforts of the BBC over the past few days.
Well, yeah, this. Look, I was talking to somebody the other day, and I said, look, if he used the platform of being live on the BBC during that talk show, I don't know the name of it, whatever, and he said it there, yeah, despicable. He can't do that. But from the privacy of his own social media, doesn't matter how famous you are, how wealthy you are, how poor you are, whatever it is, you're allowed to have a voice. That's a freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And my feeling is, okay, he's used rather emotive terms, but he's not entirely incorrect with the vilification of immigrants and asylum seekers, because that is very much the rhetoric that was used in 1930s Germany. Maybe not to the same group of people, but you can pull very, very easy parallels. I think he's at liberty to kind of express his opinion outside of his paid platform.
No, I strongly agree with the free speech point. I must say, I did see a few quotes from 1930s Germany, and whilst Braverman is a pretty disgraceful human being for what she's doing and what she's saying, whether she believes in all of that or not, there's still a couple of levels above before we get to 1930s Germany and
early 1930s.
1920s Germany might have been a bit more accurate. But I think if we don't, I'm delighted. Although I think it's more blind loyalty, but I'm delighted that free speech is being at least mentioned. Although I'm disappointed that it seems to be about second or third on the agenda. It's not been the primary cornerstone of the point. And of course, some people have used it as I heard this about, well, Alan Sugar was allowed to say this and that. And it's like, when you look into it, actually, Alan Sugar, there's no love lost between me and Alan Sugar. I'm not a big fan of the guy by any stretch of the imagination, but he did remove a tweet and apologise for what he put in it. Whereas Gary's decided to take the hard line. I do fear sometimes that the left gets a bit more room than the right does in these situations. But I also see the point that you need to use emotive language in these situations in order to provoke a reaction and get a result. And if you don't offend anyone when you open your mouth, you didn't achieve anything, probably, because someone's going to be somewhat injured by it. I don't agree with the comparison, but I do like the fact that he's put it front and center in the news, even if it is for the wrong reasons, slightly wrong reasons anyway.
I mean, for you say you think that the left gets a little bit easier or a little bit more leeway on these kind of things. I'm trying to think of an element of this story that isn't left. The very left is, equality, equal opportunity, blah, blah, blah. But apparently that doesn't apply to immigrants or asylum seekers. Like, making sure that these people have a safe haven to escape political, religious, whatever kind of
persecution, I think, is the word you're looking for, my friend.
Persecution that they're against is a very left issue. And actually what you're seeing is he's highlighting a very left issue. He's being treated like a right winger. Well, that's there because the majority of his other comments are rather right wing. But it just shows that most people are technicolor. Not everyone that stands is red, blue, or green. You're a magical mesh of all of them. I'm a big fan of, if you're a sex offender, you deserve the death penalty. But I don't believe in the death penalty intrinsically. So those are two very opposing views on the same thing. And most things that are worth talking about, or are emotive, or are challenging, are dichotomous by their very nature. And there's certain elements of these things that will be considered left or right, or will be juxtaposed to each other. Juxtaposed and they're just...
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah. But these things aren't straightforward. The fact that he's taken the hard line, as you said, is some people would call it a hard line. Some people would say he's standing by his beliefs. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we don't see very often in the public eye, especially when you're talking about politics. Because Cruella de Vil, whatever her name is, she will she'll follow whatever party line she's given. She'll gobble it up and spit it back out on the international stage. Yeah. And what annoys people like that is you have someone who's like, I don't give a fuck. I've got my millions. I've been a pundit for years. I was a footballer that didn't like to do a header or whatever his story was. I can't remember. And he's got his money. He can say what he likes. And do I think he's justified in maybe over-characterising a statement potentially? But bringing to the fact that the UK is taking on a rather negative point or view or position on, you know, safe havening people that are fleeing prosecution.
Well, yeah, the government
fleeing prosecution from countries that we've kind of kicked a hornet's nest in not too far a distant years. So you're absolutely right with all of that. But the only thing I'd take issue with there is saying that that's the UK position. It might be the UK government position, but I don't think it is think it is the UK's position. If you watch Question Time, or you look at the polling, or you, like you say, listen to the average person who hasn't got 8 million followers on Twitter and doesn't make a lot of noise, but lives somewhere in that difficult space between, or crossing from the left to the right, or sometimes just not giving a shit, really. I don't think, I mean, you know, plenty of people opened up their homes for Ukraine in as much as they were allowed to by the UK government policy. Generally speaking, you know, the whole thing, the problem on both sides of the fence here is ideology for me, because I made the point in the supplement today, right? Last year, you know, I find solace in the numbers because the numbers don't lie, right? As long as they're measured correctly. So 509,000 net migrants to the UK last year, right? Record, huge number. Now, Ukraine, Hong Kong, these are big factors. Maybe a COVID rebalancing, right? Yeah.
Either way, we're still massively short of people to fill job vacancies. And the whole of our economy, since Tony Blair, has been built on immigration for really our only shot at growth. Now, the problem is inflation is now strangling us with productivity, which we haven't been very good on, because it's putting input costs up massively, particularly wages. So there's going to be a big inflationary wave next month when minimum wage and benefits, pensions and the like go up 10%, because people are struggling and they're going to spend all of that money. That money's all going to go out into the economy. And then there's going to be headlines in like May and June going, oh, April's inflation was a bit higher than we thought it might be. And it's so bloody obvious what's going to happen to the likes of me. But people are now, immigration in September 2015 was mentioned by 71% of people who filled in a YouGov poll as one of the top 3 issues affecting the country. And it was more than double anyone who mentioned the health service, education, the economy, housing, any of the other big issues, right? Today, that's absolutely dropped through the floor. And of course, the number one is the economy, and immigration is down there with the environment as where people are currently concerned. And of course, more people than not are currently mentioning the economy because of the cost of living squeeze, right? So, but my point in that is there's no logical reason why, you know, what was the reasoning behind that massive change in opinion of importance? Maybe in 2015 we didn't have enough to worry about, and that was part of the problem. I don't know.
Well, that's in 2016.
And that's exactly why 2016 happened. Absolutely. You know, it was around the time of the election. It's exactly why the referendum was called. And then because politicians listen to pollsters, right? And then, you know, this year we're looking at we've got, you know, far bigger problems. But my point is, none of that concern by the general public is based on fact, clearly, because at the time we were having 100,000 or 200,000 people coming. And I understand if you're a blue collar worker, lives in a certain area and there's a major influx of people and you start listening to bullshitters like Nigel Farage, you're going to blame people whose fault it is not, who've tried to come to the UK to work and make a better life, right? Whereas, well, when the numbers are 2 or 3 times what they were, right, and it's not a big issue, it tells you that people aren't making these decisions based on anything remotely sensible. It's ideology. And of course, that then potentially bleeds into racism, bleeds into bias, bleeds into all of these things. Whereas, no, even Boris didn't have the balls to stand up and say, listen, this economy is built on the back of immigration, and arguably it has been since the Second World War, right? Realistically. So perhaps we should stand up and be bloody thankful for it and be grateful we live in a country that people want to come to. And instead, what happened is, when there was austerity in the early 2010s and George Osborne was taking the knife to everything, when there weren't public services available, instead of saying that's because we've had to cut the public services budget, because that was the truth, they said, actually, we might just blame some immigrants here. I mean, and look at the fallout of all of that over the past 7 or 8 years. And that's why ideology, whether it belongs to Braverman or whether it belongs to Lineker, is, in my professional view, bullshit.
Yeah. Well, the reality is it belongs to both of them, right? I
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the beauty of an ideology. It just depends on how much of an ideologue you're going to become from that, right? And you're allowed to have principles. You're allowed to stand by them. But yeah, it does make for an interesting conversation. But either way, you have to admit the language being used in the immigration bill is a little bit too tart to be palatable.
Well, who would have thought you could go worse than Priti Patel? I mean, the bookmakers would have lost a lot of money. They'd have lost a lot of money. Who's next? Can you imagine? Attila the Hun needs to be resurrected and made more right wing.
Genghis Khan.
It truly beggars, and that's one of the side effects I am really pleased about, is that indirectly there is a bit of awareness of holding Braverman to account for these terrible, billions of people and whatever was said. I mean, even though in context, it's the sound bites. I don't know how strategic or not she is about what she knows will actually escape from these debates, but it's just.
I think strategic thinking requires an element of intelligence that quite a few politicians are lacking. So you may be over, crediting her, yes. Yeah.
But it's good that if hopefully the dog whistle won't work and therefore it will go away and they'll get round to doing something that actually matters. I mean, that would be nice. That would be nice.
Well, they are really, without being too much of. They are shooting fish in a barrel, essentially, because they know that they're going to struggle to fix everything else. So they probably just look back at the last 10 years of polling and thought, what really pisses people off? And they just pick the easy wins, the things that they can remain in power with. That's all they're doing, because they can't fix anything in real terms. They have to just kind of let it wash out.
I'll tell you what it does. It does make me think they need a beating at the next election. They need it. They need it. It's not gonna help the Lawrence family P&L. I'm not gonna lie to you, but they deserve a bloody beating, because some of this stuff that's going on is the arrogance of 13, 14 years in power, and they need a beating.
I think but the problem with them having a beating is that they are arrogant enough not to learn the lesson from the beating. So it's a wasted beating. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think they need to put their heads knocked together 100%. I think they just need some actual politicians that have some real skill outside of, lambasting and beating each other over the head to gain power, because that's all they're doing. It's trading places, but with twats.
Do you see that as a real? I'd love the swamp to be drained. We all would, but even Chief Swamp Drainer couldn't drain the swamp, could he? So I don't see it.
There's got to be 3 or 4 sitting midway to the back that just aren't scummy or disparate enough to kind of be able to do something properly. And they're not going to get the limelight in the same way when we talked previously about, the people that lead these strikes. The
union barons, as the right wing like to call them. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
They're front and centre because they're just a bunch of twats, and they make the loudest noise. And they get the biggest followers, and it's the Beyonce versus Ray Dalio conversation. You've got Ray Dalio with X number of thousand, Beyonce up here. There's nothing wrong with Bebe, we all know that. But in terms of message being put out there, you could get a little bit more value from Dalio, I'm sure.
Well, maybe the thing is, you kind of need that. You've drawn a parallel I've not heard before between Ray Dalio and Gary Lineker here, really. But the point is, they've done whatever they want to do and can achieve in their respective fields, and it's time to look beyond that and say, well, you know what? hang the consequences. Because I'm sure Gary's had some pretty horrible messages this week from, and I bet you there'd be some, if he published some of those, that'd be some learning about the cesspit of the internet. I bet you. But you do need that. But don't you think it just seems to me that every day that goes on, the great and the good are less likely to want to get into politics, because the more the light gets shone on it, the worse it looks. And this is all good for accountability, but accountability only comes once every 4 or 5 years, which is not ideal in these situations. And it's a funny old game. It's not much of a. I have a simple rule around politicians. If you hear about an MP and you've never heard of them before, they're probably a really decent person who works hard in their constituency and does what they. If you've heard of them, bad news. Bad news. The odds have changed completely, because they are the ones who shouted the loudest or climbed the greasiest pole or whatever other analogy we could think of to foist upon them.
I mean, that's almost universal, isn't it? If something's going right, you never hear about it. It's only if it's gone wrong, or if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's these maxims exist because if there's someone doing good work, it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Hands up.
Sex scandals or the whatever else comes out of it. The 90s used to be brilliant for political sex scandals. There was always some MP being found in Hampstead toilets with a rent boy hanging out of either one end.
Mate, if John Major was at it, you know that the bar's quite low. Let's face it.
Yes.
That's the yardstick, if you pardon the.
All right, well, that's put me off lunch.
Luckily, nothing puts me off lunch, but I do apologise.
Brilliant. Well, it's definitely been an eventful week, and there is more to come. I guess we'll see what the consequences are from those banks fallouts, and what next week is going to be quite an eventful week as well.
Well, probably we've got a budget next week, and then we've got. I did mention Evergrande's next winding up court hearing is, I think it's Monday. It's Monday, a week tomorrow. So that whole saga's not played out yet either. So there's a few things hanging around the balance, and as Helen said, this stuff will swirl around and carry on, and that money will still be moved from the US account, the UK account to the US account overnight, and all the rest of it. And we'll be blissfully unaware in our beds, hopefully, as no news on all of that front will be good news. But we'll have to see, because there's going to be a fairly significant re-evaluation of what assets are truly worth in the market. And the stock market the FTSE will speak tomorrow morning, and let's see what happens.
Yeah.
What's your guess?
But I think we're going to be open aggressively red. But having said that, have we really learned an awful lot that we didn't know? Like I say, usually the baby goes out with the bathwater. So people who have got strong liquidity are probably going to be very good buys at this sort of stage. But it'll be months and months before anything significant plays out, would be my guess. Months and months.
So let's put some skin in the game. What's the FTSE finishing at tomorrow?
Ooh.
I'm saying -3.5.
We lost a bit. I'll go less worse. Heavy down to start with, and a bit of a recovery.
Yeah.
-2.5. There you go. I'll throw the dart. -2.5.
-2.5.
I'll settle at 17.50. I think people. The thing, I tell you what, the thing with stuff like this that's kind of been borne out the last 6 or 7 years is people hear stuff like this and they don't hear issue, they hear opportunity. So I think people are going to be looking at these down-valued things like Barclays and people like that, and they're going to think, well, they didn't take tarps in 2008, they've taken nothing else. Okay, they've sucked a little Saudi cock along the way, but who cares? And they'll probably rally in terms of buying in. So I think 17.50. I think the market will.
Helen, do you think that will be in the breakfast briefings tomorrow morning in such a? Probably proper trading desk chat, that is, isn't it? Proper trading desk chat.
Absolutely love it.
So what's your guess for FTSE, Helen?
I'm with Adam on it will open massively down, but as always, like you've already said, like there'll be buying opportunities there.
By the
I'd say we see a couple of days down, but then it will bounce back. I can't remember what numbers people have claimed. I'll go 4%. There you go.
Okay. Well, we've got our guesses. The game is on.
And let's be clear, they are guesses, absolutely. Yeah.
Surprise always is bragging rights about being right, Piotr. Don't pretend there's anything else that we value in this group. Who was the closest? Who was right? Who won? Who won? That's all we care about.
Yeah. Cut to the chase. Cut to the chase.
Okay, amazing. Well, let's wrap it up for today. We've got a few things to do while in Dubai.
Got some sunbathing to do.
Enjoy. Very jealous.
It looks sunny where you are, Adam, as well. So it's
Yeah, it's a good 3 degrees if that's gives you any FOMO. Yeah, absolutely.
It's only 33 here.
1 digit difference. Okay, amazing. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll be back next week in our international format. So yeah.
Cool.
See you, everyone.
Bye.
Cheers.
Later, guys.